next session will be the Social Analytics and Digital Experimentation session with Professors Sinan Aral, Renee Gosline, and Glenn Irvin.
All right. Everybody hear me okay? Great. Thank you. I'm Sinan Aral. I'm leading the initiative in its research on social analytics and experimentation. Just want to frame this next set of conversations briefly for you, and then I'll get out of the way and let you get to the meat of it. But before I do that, I just want to make a plug for this amazing t-shirt that all of you have potential access to. I'm not sure what Christy's going to make you do to get one of these, but I think that they're going for like $50 on eBay. So you might want to get in there early and do whatever she says. Okay, so we're very excited about this pillar because we think that it is really hitting a sweet spot with a few topics that enterprises are very interested in today. Obviously, we're moving from this notion of a single consumer where you message that individual to this notion that these consumers are connected in networks. They're speaking to each other about your products and services, and how do we talk to the consumer that's connected in a network? Obviously, analytics is one of the hottest topics. There's a rise of access to granular data. We want to know how to analyze that data in smart ways to make smart decisions and to change our strategies in productive ways. And certainly experimentation is one of the keys to that. It's a good way to learn quickly. It's also a good way to be certain about the mechanisms that are driving consumer behavior and so on. So I just want to give you one example before I introduce our first speaker that sort of encapsulates this pillar for us. I read very broadly outside of my area, and this is a good example of something that came up in what I was reading that delineates this pillar quite well. So Cell Magazine, February 11, 2016, very recent, published a new article. And in this article, Gillian Matthews, who was a PhD student at University College London, now a postdoc at MIT, randomly isolated mice that she had in her laboratory and was trying to understand dopamine neurons. So she injected some of them with cocaine in a randomized experiment and injected the other group with saline solution. Okay, and you're probably wondering to yourself, Sinan, why did I come to a conference on the digital economy to learn about what cocaine does to my brain? It's not because those two things are similar, but for a very different reason. And what she found was really quite stunning. She found major synaptic changes in dopamine neurons in the dorsal raphe nucleus, which is an important part of the dopamine system. And that was pretty striking and interesting, and that's really what she was trying to study. But the outcome of this experiment was actually a little bit more complicated than that. So what she found was that both groups experienced the same very significant changes in their dopamine neurons. So can anybody explain to me why, after doing this experiment where some rats were injected with cocaine and other rats were injected with plain old water or saline solution, that they would experience the same changes in their dopamine neurons? Anybody have a guess?
Were they in a group?
They were in a group. Somebody says placebo effect. They were in a right. So the answer is the common factor was that the mice were isolated from one another. And so when she set out to try and understand the effects of cocaine on dopamine neurons, what she actually found is that we inherit the neural pain of being alone, which motivates us to be social. Okay? So this is a very biological and sort of neurally driven consumer behavior. And the takeaway is that the pain of isolation drives us to find friends. And the reason I bring this up for you is because it really points to the two major aspects of this pillar, which are experimentation and social analytics. Okay? Social is a really big part of who we are as human beings. It is part of every decision that we make, every consideration set that we look into. Every way we act in society is a social way of acting. and to really figure out how that's working, whether it's at the level of dopamine neurons or at the level of consumer behavior or many other things, we really have to experiment to find these things that are perhaps counterintuitive and not essentially what we were looking for in the first place. So our first presenter is Renee Gosline. She's a professor here at the Sloan School. She's been doing some amazing work on consumer behavior using both experimental and non-experimental methods, and I'll let her tell you the rest. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. You still with me? It's late in the day, so I'll try to make this as painless as possible. You can start off by getting the screen back on, and then we'll be in good shape. Right. So I'm here to talk to you about the behavioral side of the pillar that Sinan introduced. I'm trying to understand how in all of this technology and digitization, we don't lose the human element. And in fact, how humans and technology are fusing in some ways, and that we're increasingly outsourcing our decisions. And how those decisions, when mediated by technology, sometimes lead to better choices, sometimes not so good choices. But ultimately, the goal is for us to find an equilibrium where, during this exchange, we're able to benefit the firm, benefit the consumer in a way that is mutually beneficial. So I'll start off with an image that represents the mind. And this is a pretty famous representation of the mind, the iceberg. As you know, the tip of the iceberg is just the beginning. Most of it is beneath the surface. And the way that our incredible brains work, the reason why we can get so much done is because we can process consciously about as much information as fits on a Post-it note, right? So you're hearing me speak, you're hopefully not looking at your smartphone, and you're thinking consciously. But most of the work, most of the heavy lifting goes on beneath the surface, your non-conscious mind, right? And so those are the things that are happening, and you're processing without even paying attention. One way we can think about this is thinking fast and slow. So if I were to show you a picture of one of those coked up mice or a rat, you might find it disgusting because it doesn't take much cognitive effort to have a fast reaction to a rat. I myself don't care for them. I am from New York, so I've had my fair share of exposure, unfortunately. But if I ask you a question, not do you find this gross, but rather I say, what do you expect your tax refund to be, right? That's not fast thinking. It's a little bit more labored, a little bit more slow. And the reason why that is important here is because we use what are called heuristics. We use shortcuts. We can't possibly give everything the same amount of analysis. And so you may be familiar then with fast thinking or slow thinking and, relatedly, nudges, right? And so what nudges are an examination of how the context we're in affects the decisions and the choices that we make in a way that's non-conscious. And that's important to know because no matter how intelligent you are, and we know that everyone in this room is off the charts with intelligence, we're all subject to cognitive bias because we're trying to do too much with too little time and during a cognitive load. So I'm trying to understand how these automatic or reflective brain systems get affected when they're mediated by technology, and what that means for the choices of your consumers, and what that means for the kinds of platforms or settings that you would create. And this sort of digital revolution that we're all a part of is pretty incredible because we have, for the first time ever, a whole other set of nudges that help us eat the right things at the right time, take a jog, maybe even drive better. And so this is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night and the kind of stuff I want to share with you. It's important because the old notion of what a marketer or a firm controls versus some of the new notions you hear about the advent of consumer empowerment, well, neither really is an accurate representative of what's going on. What's really going on is you have almost this seesaw that's dynamic. And sometimes the consumers are telling you what to do, and sometimes you're in control, and sometimes you're sharing it, right? And so we want to understand, as Sinan alluded to earlier, not just how brands or businesses affect consumers B2C, but also C2C, how consumers interact with one another, and then how they go back to the brand or the business and then tell them what to do, this dynamic process. So what are the implications? I'd like to share with you today 3 projects that we have going on at the IDE that pick apart at different aspects of it. And you can think about these 3 projects as starting off very high level and developing theory, and then I'll share with you some data and some technology that's being developed here and used at MIT, and then I'll get even more granular, but I promise the numbers won't be as ugly as they sound. Okay, so the first I want to talk to you about is some work that I'm doing in collaboration with Capgemini about the customer experience and how we can develop strategy around that. And spoiler alert, we're not here to say that every firm should seek to create this amazing collaborative environment. In fact, if you look at the value chain of the firm, there may be some aspects that are beneficial or benefit from collaboration, and other aspects where it's not the right thing to do. So we're looking at what that looks like. The next is in conjunction with BMW. And with this research, we're trying to look at emotions, not lose the human in the sort of society part, and understand how, though we are emotional beings, technology can respond to our emotions where the sum is greater than the parts, because we're conveying our emotions, the cars we drive or the machines we use are anticipating, and how we could potentially morph according to emotions and maybe even match according to emotional states. And then lastly, I'd like to talk to you about some research I'm doing with MassMutual about co-creation, where brands and consumers get together to share narratives, the most fundamental form of human communication, stories, and how we can look at that as interacting with different media to understand how the media mix can work for us. The common thread through all of these is that we look at the consumer behavior as well as firm performance, and particularly for the last 2, we use experimental methodology, which allows us to really make causal statements as opposed to correlations or other kinds of conclusions. So I'd like to start with the Capgemini project, which I am working on in conjunction with DDA and Akshita, who are over here and are pretty awesome. If you haven't spoken to them yet, do that before the day is through. So, Capgemini, some of this stuff talked about earlier. The structure, quite literally, of firms is changing in that it's become more porous, right? So there's this sort of digital organization. And we can see many examples of this, where the firm is sort of outsourcing some of its work by getting consumers to provide ideas, to manage themselves, or to even develop products, to enhance media that they create by injecting tweets while you're watching a show, to get people to use wearables and to have an even more intimate relationship with technology. You look at your phone first thing in the morning and last thing at night, your poor spouse is there. And these wearables are getting even more intimate with us. Social platforms recommendations where people do the marketing for us and give the reviews for us, which we spoke about earlier. All of these collaborative touch points, and we want to understand which touch points make sense for you. Ultimately, the question then is who wins? You see here a product. It's a plug, but the plug takes information about your usage and then feeds back to you how many kilowatts you've used so that you can then adjust your energy usage and hopefully reduce the amount of money you spend and also the waste, right? So we want to understand from a consumer perspective, when is this I'm giving you all of my business, all of my information, you know everything about me? When is that deemed exploitative? And when is that deemed innovative? And from the firm standpoint, when is it being accurately or purposely leveraged versus just collected and collecting dust and being sort of wasteful? And so what we want to do is develop a methodology that creates a typology. And here are our independent variables. First, we are analyzing data for firm collaborative touch points. So about 40 items, both on the data, the firm side and the customer side, to allow us to build a scale, and also looking at how that is happening on the consumer side. And then we're measuring not only financial performance, but also what people are saying in social media. We're scraping data from social media and analyzing those data to understand not only are you making money, but are you doing it in a way where you have people who are happy? Are you holding them hostage and extracting value? Or are they also receiving value in return? And then we're supplementing this with interviews to understand the thinking behind these strategic moves. And this is leading us to a theory of collaborative customer experience, how you can actually create a win-win situation with your customers. The goal is to then, as we are in the process of doing this, plot based on two axes, two kinds of markets that we're measuring. The first is the participation shared between you and the customer versus the participation controlled by you. And then, that being a participation market that has value, the information that you gather from a customer versus the amount of information that you leverage. We then will be able to plot different firms on these axes to say, how are you leveraging and creating value, both with regard to participation and with regard to information? That leads us to a model that gives us examples where we have innovation that increases loyalty, increases sales, reduces resource costs, increases innovation, and ultimately leads to value that is extracted both for the firm and for the customer, making sure that this is, in fact, a win-win equilibrium. And our thinking is that the touch points we are concerned about is firm value with regard to reduced risk, for instance, and customer value with regard to efficiency. All of these data that we collect are being fed into this model to allow us to plot the firms that we're examining, but also allow people like yourselves to look across your value chain, your R&D, your logistics, your marketing, your customer service, and figure out, are you maximizing collaboration? Should you be maximizing collaboration at each of these points? And how is your customer feeling about it? What is the experience? And ultimately, if it is a collaborative customer experience. So that's the high-level theory that we're developing in conjunction with Capgemini. Then I want to get a little bit more narrow with some technology that we're using in conjunction with BMW. And my BMW colleagues are out of the country, not surprisingly, and were unable to join us. And this research really actually was inspired by some work that Glenn pioneered with ad morphing, where this work says, okay, we have different people with different cognitive styles. Some people are more analytical, others are more emotional. What happens if you take the same information on a website, for instance, you're able to analyze what kind of person they are, and then you morph the website to match their cognitive styles? Well, no one's really looked at this, though, with regard to emotion. And it's an important thing from a behavioral standpoint because of something called emotional contagion. Turns out that when I'm looking in the room and I see your faces, you're conveying a lot of information that you don't realize you're conveying. When you interact with people in a social network, how pleasant your face is, the tilt of your eyebrows, all of these things lead people to decide whether they want to continue to interact with you, because if you seem sour, they don't want to catch that emotional contagion. But it also leads people to decide whether you're trustworthy. And so we're looking at emotional contagion as it relates to these media. BMW right now has two kinds of websites. One is bmw.com, where they have content publishing. It's just sort of, how beautiful the car is, for instance. And then bmwusa.com that is much more sales and dealership driven. Well, we're trying to find out whether you can match emotional states. And it's important because we're not just talking about a funnel where you go from awareness to consideration and preference. We're talking about a very jumbled, dynamic experience because of digital technology. And we're also talking about emotional moods because they have a strong effect on our decision making. They affect how we anticipate the future. For instance, if you're in a positive mood, you're more likely to be effective with creative tasks. But if you're in a negative mood, you're more likely to be critical and therefore have attention to detail. You can imagine then this would affect your experience when purchasing a car and evaluating what kind of information is important before you make your choice. If you're in a positive mood, you tend to have more integrative thinking. But if you're in a negative mood, you start to look at errors and problems. If you're in a positive mood, inductive reasoning. If you're in a negative mood, very careful information processing. So with all of these intelligent vehicles, intelligent technologies around us, what does this mean for us? So we've conducted an experiment. We had them look at a video of a driver at a race course in Germany. And in this video, the driver is a professional driver, but he's driving his wife. And he's driving pretty recklessly. He's clearly trying to torture her. And she's clearly unhappy. And we took that very same video and we spliced it. And in one condition, you can see her shrieking, begging him to slow down as he speeds up toward motorcyclists. And in the other condition, you can see his face and he's pretty pleased with himself. And he's very confident. Well, it turns out research on behavioral science indicates that when you prime an emotional state, you have very different behavioral outcomes. In particular, when you make people feel powerful and in control, right, they're less likely to engage in what are called compensatory behaviors. They're less likely to feel like they got to buy that really fast car or that really expensive bag or flashy piece of jewelry. But when you put people into a state of powerlessness, well, then they're willing to open their wallets to alleviate that feeling. It's called compensatory consumption. And so in this experiment, this 2x2, we manipulated whether people felt confident or whether they felt anxiety, whether they felt like this driver who was in control or whether they felt like his wife who couldn't get out of that car fast enough. And we then either matched the video to their feeling or we mismatched, right? So you either have an emotional match where you have someone who's experiencing anxiety and powerlessness, who's shown someone experiencing anxiety, or a mismatch where, for example, you have a powerful person being shown someone experiencing anxiety. And here's how we're measuring it. In addition to the traditional measures of how do you feel, what do you think, we're using some deep learning technology that was developed here at MIT called Affectiva. What Affectiva does is it has collected through 75 countries the minute details of millions of people's faces. So it doesn't matter if you have a natural scowl or a natural smile. What this software does is it looks at you while you're looking at the video. And it measures what happens to your face. Do you crease your eyebrows? Do the corners of your mouth go up? What are you feeling? What are you experiencing? And therefore, we're able to get people to feel an emotion, to get the computer to measure the emotion that they feel, whether they are reporting that or not, and to make decisions accordingly. This is important because whether you match or mismatch has implications for the consumer behavior. And this data has just come in. We're in the process of cleaning and analyzing it. But our hypothesis is that people are happiest with a brand like BMW when you have a low power, meaning they're in a low power state, but a mismatch with the media that they see, which is confident. Because what happens is you start off feeling kind of low, but if you're able to take the perspective of this confident driver, you've now left, after watching that video, feeling a whole lot better. And that makes you feel a whole lot better about the brand BMW that's brought it to you. This is important not only because of the customer experience today, but because the cars we are going to be driving tomorrow will be able to tell if we haven't had enough sleep last night, if we've gotten into an argument, if we're listening to our favorite song and maybe a little too into it and not paying attention to the roads. And therefore, our human experience can be coupled with the digital technology to make safer roads and more enjoyable customer experiences. Now, the last project I'd like to speak with you briefly about is one where we look at how media can create synergies. When does 1 + 1 equal more than 2? You know, you're showing an advertisement on television, you've got some things going on social media. Is it possible that these things are greater than their individual components? So we look at the power of narratives, and narratives are a very old and fundamental way of communication of human beings. It's why you learned as a child very important stories and lessons in Mother Goose and other kinds of story form. And it's why big data is particularly compelling, because it takes all of these disparate data points and coalesce them into essentially a story. And brands that are able to create compelling stories can win what in this book is called the story wars. Stories are powerful for choice, though, because of the way our brains work. You know that iceberg I showed you at the beginning? We can't possibly pay attention to each thing equally. And it turns out that when information is in a narrative form, our brains are more likely to encode it. That means we're more likely to hold on to it. And that also means when given a consideration set, we're more likely to retrieve a particular company's name before making our choice. It also means that when we're sharing stories with one another, the parts of our brain that light up the storyteller and the person who's listening to the story start to look alike. Actual syncing between brains. So with this research, we wanted to do an experiment to find out, we've got all these stories on social media, we've got companies creating stories that they're making advertisements about. Is there an interaction between this narrative structure and the media that you're using? And we had 3 independent variables. The first was the degree to similarity across the media, the social media and the traditional media. The next variable was whether that story or that narrative, although identical, was brought to you by a brand or was brought to you by a consumer. And the last was the order in which you saw them, whether you saw an ad first and then went to social media or vice versa. Now, you may have different expectations about this, and we wanted to find out what the real deal was. For instance, you can imagine if your television spot looks a lot like what you have on social media, people might be bored because it's like, that's the same stuff I've seen on television. But it could also be more effective, right? Because it's another exposure that really makes it more memorable. Now, with regard to authorship, you could imagine that a story that's being told to you in conjunction with a consumer feels more authentic, right? It's Joe Blow's story, not some nameless, faceless corporation trying to convince me of something. But at the same time, when the corporation or the company or the brand is behind the story, it may feel more polished. It may feel like, you know, it's been vetted, and this is something to pay attention to, as opposed to some kind of marginalized experience. And when it comes to the order of seeing something on TV or seeing something on social media, which one's better? Is it better to learn about it on television and then see it on social media, or vice versa? No one really has the answer to these questions. And we wanted to understand that to find out what kind of system we're living in. So we did this experiment with TV and with social media. And here's what we found when we changed the narrative of someone who is experiencing something as presented to you by the brand versus their own story. When you show them only one kind of media, meaning you don't show them both, you show them one and you measure after the first exposure. Showing them social media alone is more effective than showing television. We didn't expect that to be the case. But when you show them both, what we find is something different happens. There are order effects. So if people are going to see both kinds of media, it's better to show them the television first, followed by social media after. So if there's only one, it's social, but if it's both, it's different. And when it comes to what medium is more effective and what kind of story is more effective, amongst people who are familiar with your brand, turns out that television first, again, is most effective, and co-created narratives, narratives that feature the voice of the customer as well as the brand, are far more persuasive than any other kind of social media. So what I'd like to share with you in conclusion is that behavioral science is a lens that's important for us to understand what people are actually experiencing during this digital revolution, and really bringing the human back to the data points that we're analyzing. How to create a win-win with collaboration, how emotions can be manipulated in a way that enhances consumer experiences and how you can have synergy between the different kinds of media. And so my question to you is, what kind of behavioral nudges are you intentionally or unintentionally using with your company? There's more to come. Thank you for your attention.
We can take one question, maybe two if they're short. Questions?
I have a question. Do you have a sense of why that order effect happens with TV and social media?
Yeah, we're actually looking for covariates right now to answer that. We think that there may be something about a social network effect where perhaps if you see it in social media first, you feel like all of your friends know about it immediately, but if you see it on television first, you can then, somehow filter that knowledge through your network. So we're still trying to figure that out because we were surprised by that effect.
Do you control for gender in your experiments? Do you break it down by male or female respondents to ads?
Yes, so we had 4,000 respondents that were balanced with regard to gender, and gender is not significant in the models that I showed you. One thing we think might be significant, though, is age, particularly because this is mass mutual, and so you could imagine that age and familiarity with the company are highly correlated.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.